Hello everybody, this is Caden here with Kepler Electronics, and welcome to the second episode of Devlog. This is a show where I talk about my journey in creating the game Gravitas, which is a side shooter reminiscent of Galaxian, Space Invaders, and the like. So, this is made in Pico 8. If you want to hear my explanation of what Pico 8 is, go see the first episode. The playlist will be linked down in the description. Well, let's get started. So, essentially, since the last episode, I have gone through and added in a lot of things. Here's my list of all the things that I've done. It's a lot, and I figured now would be a great time to kind of go through and make a new episode. I'm going to try and keep this one shorter than the first one, because that one was almost ridiculously long. It should not have been that long, but here we go. So we get over to animation, which we get to see the logo, which is what I'm going to go over first. So essentially, I have variables for the Kepler and the electronics. So I have the X and the Y position to basically make them centered on the screen, but be off the screen so that they can slide onto the screen. I use a map that essentially makes it so that I don't have to make each individual sprite, which would just be kind of painful. I don't have to animate each individual sprite and choose the X and Y position for each individual sprite. So I create the map of that I create the map of each individual text box at Kepler X and Kepler Y, which makes it off screen, and then electronics Y and electronics X. So then essentially I move them to the center of the screen. So if Kepler Y is less than or equal to 59, then increment the Y value positively to move it down the screen. If it's greater than or equal to 59, then has the sound effects played, then if not, play the sound effects, and then say the sound effects has been played. Then increment sound effects weight. Now what sound effects weight does is essentially, once the sound effect is played when Kepler and electronics have met in the middle, it will wait until the sound effect is done playing, so it'll wait 60 frames or about a second, and then move electronics to the right of the screen and Kepler to the left of the screen. And that's essentially how the intro works. The sound effect is 3 simple notes. It is a C, a D, and a G, C3, D3, and G3. Slightly different from the original intro that I used to use. I think I'm going to switch over to using this one because I like it more. It's nicer. So essentially, that's how the intro works. It's pretty simple. Not too much to do. It was interesting learning how to do the sound effects in Pico 8 because I'd never really dabbled with that before. But essentially, what happens is, if sound effects weight is less than or 170, then do the logo. So since it starts at 0, the logo starts first. And if it's greater than 170, draw stars and draw the title. And the same thing, if it's greater than 170, then do the title screen and spawn the stars. But I'm going to comment this out for the time being, just so that we don't really have, so that I can start the game and we don't end up with the intro, just because it makes stuff a little bit simpler when I'm showing you things. So the next thing on the list is I added a placeholder shop system. So if I go into here, just turn midwave to true, so that way we go straight into the shop system. Essentially, what this does is it's a placeholder shop system, so just kind of here, because I haven't really decided what I want to be purchasable. So I can scroll up and down. I can't scroll farther than the top. I can't scroll farther than the bottom. If I hit any button on the placeholders, it doesn't do anything right now, but if I hit any button on continue, it brings you to the next wave. But since it's midwave and the shop is active all of the time right now because of that one line of code, then it just kind of re-increments the shop and increments the wave counter. So that's essentially how that works. If I go to menus and stuff, I believe it is all the way down at the bottom. It is kind of complicated. But what I said here is keep in mind layers. The first thing is drawn, then it's the bottom layer. So we draw the map, which is this this square that has that essentially just has a border. It's got a kind of nice color so that you can easily see things. Then we print the shop so that you can it just kind of shows you, hey, this is the shop. Then we print all of the placeholders and continue. And I have these comments right here to show that. So if cell count or select counter is 1, then you see placeholder. Then your selected then placeholder 1 is selected. If cell count is 2, placeholder 3, etc., etc. If cell count is 5, so you're mousing over or you're selecting continue, then if you press any button, then shop done is true and it will continue the game. So if you press down and cell count is less than or equal to 4, then increment cell count by 1. If you press the button up and cell count is greater than or equal to 2, then cell count equals cell count minus 1. So the thing that you have to remember about this is that 0 is technically a number as well, and that was something that I didn't really remember. And so that's why these are kind of weird. Cell count is less than or equal to 4, so it's just interesting. There's some weirdness there, but that's why I did that. This insufficient funds thing, this isn't used right now, but yeah, it'll probably be used in the future. So that's about it for the shop. So I added borders, which are pretty self-explanatory. I added red borders on the side of the screen. It just required moving the score over to the right about 1 pixel or 2 pixels, and moving the lives in towards the middle about 1 or 2 pixels. And it just kind of adds a nice border to the screen, so you can kind of see, hey, that's the edge of the screen. I just think it looks better, so that's why I added that. And we get to stars. I made a lot of changes to the stars. So let's start with the first thing. I added a new field, star.layer. Now essentially what this is whenever a star is created, it will randomly select a layer. And if the layer is 1, then the star is slower and it's a single pixel. If the star layer is 0, then it's slower and it's a single pixel. It moves down by 1 pixel every frame. But if the star layer is 1, then we draw it with a line, and the star increments down by 2. It increments by 2 pixels every frame. Essentially, the way that works is I just randomize the value with a maximum of 2. So there's actually one value that I believe isn't being used, but that's not a super big deal. It just kind of serves to thin out the stars a little bit more, because I think it looks pretty good if you do that. So one thing that I did, and it's not really needed anymore because I'm not using pset for both of them. I'm using line for the layer 1 stars, is I did star.layer plus 6. So essentially there's layer 1 and there's layer 0. And if we look, so that's the star color is 6 and 7. And if we look at what 6 and 7 are, is this darker gray color for the background stars and color 7, which is the white color for the foreground stars. And that just ended up being kind of a nice coincidence, so that I didn't really have, so that I could change the color of the star per layer. But it's not super necessary anymore because I'm using separate functions, pre-built functions for layer 0 and layer 1 stars. Go back, I thinned the stars, which essentially I just had a timer that self-increments, And if timer is 1, then create a star. If timer is 0, then you don't create a star. And when it gets to 1, it will de-increment the star or the timer back to 0. So every other frame it creates a star, which just makes it so that there's less stars in it. I think I like the way it looks more. I already talked about how I made the top layer stars lines. So we move on to the next item of business, which is I renamed malts to coins. So if we scroll up to the top of these, all of these, it said coin. They used to say malt, which essentially, I used to have a multiplier system in place where it would multiply the score every time you got one. So it would multiply the score. But because Pico 8 only has a 16-bit number system, you would end up rolling over. So you'd end up with hitting the maximum and rolling back over to the negative numbers. So multipliers weren't really feasible or useful or fun. So I swapped them over to coins, and for the longest time they still said malts or malt. So I just renamed everything to coin, and it works fine now. So I improved the player animation. So if you recall from last episode, the player's animation, all the way down here at the bottom, essentially was every single frame was mapped out. So if player count equals 0, then show this frame. If player count equals 1, show this frame. And each frame it would increment the counter by 1. The problem with that is that it was like 99 else ifs. And if you look, when I delete this else if, look at the token count. The token count decreases. So if I comment this out, it drops dramatically. So essentially getting rid of each else if was amazing. And I ended up basically just saving more than 1,400 tokens, which means that I can add a lot more stuff to this game. If we go back to animation, essentially the way I did it was the way I should have done it in the first place. I couldn't get it to work the first time, and I don't know why. I got it to work this time, but essentially it's if player count is greater than 0, and player count is less than or equal to 9, then show this frame. If it's greater than or equal to 10 and less than or equal to 19, then show this frame, etc., etc., etc. I don't really know why this one still has player count plus 1 in it. But yeah. So essentially I was able to take out a lot of lines of code, about 300 lines of code I think, save about 1,400 tokens. Yeah, so really, really happy with how that turned out. It was something that I had wanted to do for a while. And then we get to the two major additions that, or not major additions, but major changes that took me a while to figure out. I moved the lasers over to table, the player's lasers, and moved the enemy lasers over to table. Now these are basically the exact same thing, but I'll start with player first. So if we go to collision, you can see I created the lasers. Now this is very similar to the create object functions that Davbo provided on the forums. Thanks again to him. He was or her. Thank you so much. It was a great help, just kind of figuring out how to use tables. And now I feel pretty confident that I can create tables. So essentially, I created a table for lasers that holds every laser. And then I created a table for each individual laser. And then each individual laser has a X and a Y position. The Y is a set value because it was throwing me errors because it was saying that it was a nil value. So essentially changing the position to, or the Y position to 120, which is the player's Y position, fixed that. I also have a laser power attribute that is not really being used right now. And then I add the laser tables to the lasers master table. So essentially each laser is its own mini table, which is then added to the master laser table. So if we start, I can show you that before I was only able to have 3 lasers on screen at once. Now I can have a lot more. Essentially, I was trying to limit the number of lasers that the player could have on screen at once. And I tried doing that a couple different ways, both by using the pairs function and some code I found online to count how many variables there were in the table. And I also tried basically just every time you create a laser, increment a value. If it's greater than the max value, then you can't create a new laser. But the problem is that it wasn't de-incrementing it. Because essentially, from what I can figure out, is there is effectively an infinite number of lasers in the table. And this is the same thing that was happening when I had when I was using 2 individual variables, when I was using the pairs function. It was just being weird and essentially just creating a wraparound where it was incrementing so fast and then wrapping back around, and it was just annoying, and I couldn't figure it out. So I kind of just gave up on it and finished the lasers. I might try and go back and finish that because I think it'd be cool to be able to purchase more lasers in the shop system so that you have more firepower. But that's for future. So essentially, for each laser, do laser.y is laser.y minus laser speed. So right now it's set at 2, but in the future I can increment it so that the lasers travel faster if you're using lasers travel faster if you purchase something in the shop, which would allow you to make more precise shots, so you don't have to worry about the enemy moving and stuff like that. And then if the laser reaches the top of the screen, then delete the laser from the table and free up some memory. So that's essentially how that works. If I go into animation, all the way up to the top-ish, draw a line with at laser X, laser Y, laser X, and then laser Y plus 4, and then with color 8, which is red. So it's essentially a line. I used to have a sprite for it right here, but I don't need it anymore, so it's not super necessary. So now we get to, I have to talk about, essentially the way I do it is if you press button X, then laser spawns at player X plus 3, because player X, the X position is technically, I believe, this top corner. If I go to the plus 3, so 0, 1, 2, 3, we get to this pixel right here. So effectively it just makes it so that it doesn't look like the player's shooting out of this wing or this wing instead this cannon on the front, similar to what you'd see in like Galaxian. Create it at 120. I don't need this value anymore. And a power of 1. I used to have laser speed inside of the inside of here, but since I'm using it, I thought that it would be easier to change the value just as like a global variable instead of having it tied into this table. That I just left it outside of the table, and I think that ends up working really well. So essentially we get to the enemy lasers, which essentially the way it works, it's the exact same thing. There's no enemy laser power, but I'm pretty sure I could go and add that in pretty easily. So it's the same thing, create a master table for the enemy lasers, go through and make it so that the Y is not nil, add the X and the Y value to a single table, which is then added to the master table. Then the way it works is, I went over this last time, but I have laser counter, or laser C, which generates a random integer, that's what the FLR is for, with a maximum of Li, which is this value, so it's 300. So you have a 3 in 300 chance of it firing. So the way I do it, the reason I do it like this is basically so that I can just increase the probability that they will fire every wave, just to give it a little bit more challenge. It's not a ton. I might actually want to make it a little bit more challenging because it's pretty easy right now, but yeah. So essentially the way I do it is if the player isn't dead and if the enemy isn't dead, then if the laser counter is true, if it hits that 1 in 3, if it hits that 1 in 300 chance that this enemy will fire, then fire the laser, call the function enemy laser spawn at enemy 1x and the Y at position 8. I just chose position 8 because even though the enemy is at position 10, it looked better at position 8, so I'm just leaving it at that. And I have the same thing duplicated for both of the other enemies. And for enemy laser, in all enemy lasers, do enemy laser.y equals enemy laser.y plus 2. I could also add a enemy laser counter or enemy laser speed, but that shouldn't be too difficult to add down the road if I want to. And then if it goes off the screen, delete it. It's pretty simple. Yeah, so the one thing that's not great is that there is no collision right now. Just insert collision code here for the player lasers and insert collision code here for the enemy lasers, just because it wouldn't be too hard to implement it for the player, but when implementing the player shooting at enemy ships, I wanted to wait until I had moved the enemies over to a table so that I basically didn't have to write collision code for the third time. Because I wrote collision code when everything was basically variables, then I would have to write collision code for when the lasers are in a table but the enemies are still variables, and then I'd have to write collision code yet again for when both the player's lasers and the enemies are in tables. I have no excuse for the player's laser, but I figured that this video was going to be long enough already. I didn't want to have another ridiculously long video like the first episode of Devlog, so I just kind of decided to call development for right now so I could work on this video. So that's essentially what I did. This is all of the things that I've done since last episode, and there are more things that I want to do. I've already improved the player explosion, moved the lasers over to the table, and I added some new things to do that I want to do. So I want to make the circle button or the Z key on your keyboard do something in-game. Maybe another weapon that has a charge-up time. Not sure. I could use that with the shop, maybe. I also want to animate the player. Some sort of thruster on the back, just to kind of give it a little bit of uniqueness. I want to add music, which I'm not good at writing music. I've tried. Not super great at it. I'm gonna keep trying. I might see if I can find someone in Pico 8, the community, that's good at it. See if someone wants to do it. But that's something for later down the road. I also really want to add sound effects. That shouldn't be super difficult for me to add myself. That'll probably come when I add collision in. I want to use particles for animations. Possibly, just because that looks kind of cool. I've seen it in other games. Geometry Wars, which is Xbox. It's on Xbox, the original DS, PS4, iPhone, whatever. It's on a lot of different consoles. It's got some really unique. It looks really good when they use particles, and that's what originally inspired the multiplier thing that's now scrapped. But yeah, so I think it might be cool to use particles, but improve the enemy animation. So I don't know how I'm gonna do that. I kind of wrote that and then forgot that the enemy animation is only 5 frames, so it wasn't 100 frames like the player. Yeah, I could make the enemy death animation longer. That might be cool. I don't know. I'm just gonna improve it. That could go hand in hand with using particles for explosions. But if I decide not to use particles for explosions, then I might try and do the enemy animation in like a lower, in a way that just kind of ends up a little bit more efficient. And then I wanted to add enemy lasers to table. That was a new thing that I added, but I ended up actually getting that out before this episode of Devlog. So I've gotten a lot done, a surprising amount. And I guess I also added the things I've done list to this episode just so I could kind of more easily keep track of, here's all of the changes that I've made since the last episode. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you haven't seen the first episode of Devlog, be sure to go check that out. I will have the link to the playlist in the description. And if you want to check out my other videos, be sure to subscribe. I do a lot of electronics and particularly robotics content, but I'm branching out into other stuff, like the Devlog, the series. It's things are changing. I like the way things are headed. So be sure to stick around. Leave a like if you liked it. Yeah, and if you want, follow me on Twitter. I have links in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.